This video contains spoilers for Chapter 2 of Doctor Who Flux. War of the Sontarans sees both the continuation of the ongoing Flux storyline, as well as a standalone chapter about the Sontarans in the 19th century. Our main characters are all split from one another and find themselves dealing with their own unique challenges across space and time. I have to say I am really glad that I liked this episode. I mean, it's the return of the Sontarans. Almost everybody else likes it, and I'd hate to be down on the show 2 episodes in a row. After last week's overstuffed, underdeveloped, and overall mixed introduction, it was nice to watch an episode that I was just able to have a good time with. It's not one of the defining episodes of the Jodie Whittaker era, but it stands out to me as a really fun and enjoyable story, which does a really solid job in its presentation of the Sontarans. And here's what this episode gets right, which was so crucial. That was letting the main plot of the episode breathe with the overarching Flux storyline not overshadowing it, at least too much. Based on the Halloween apocalypse and how it set up this season, I was really hoping that the remaining 5 chapters would each get to develop villains and actually do something substantial with them. And this episode has basically taken the exact approach I was both expecting and hoping the show would. Because there is that focus on the Sontarans in the 19th century, there is something grounding this whole episode. And it doesn't feel like this one has too much going on. It almost gets to that point, but stops short of giving us too much with Swarm and Azure. It's a tough act to balance, and Chris Chibnall has done a relatively good job of doing so. And the Sontarans really are what make this story. If they were poorly handled, this entire thing would have fallen apart. And to me, this is one of, if not the best portrayals of them in the modern series of the show. They aren't treated in here as a joke, but it also doesn't present them as humorless. To me, they gave us a great balance of serious drama for our characters to deal with and comedic moments. And the comedy in this one lands a whole lot better than in the last chapter. Not everything works, but there's a fair amount to be amused by.
Take your hat off, mate! Ah, on second thoughts, put it back on! Why Sebastopol?
The Crimean skirmish seems the perfect place to start. So much conflict, so much opportunity. And also, I wanted to ride a horse.
And I've got this obsession with Japanese food. I heard one of the chief potato heads talking about tempura command, tempura offensive. What's that all about?
Could it have been temporal command? Temporal is in time.
Oh yeah, that makes more sense.
The Sontaran, played by Dan Starkey, who has been captured and treated by their enemies, works rather well as this shamed Sontaran. It's actually kind of interesting to watch him go from being captured to released, and seeing that even though he isn't being held prisoner anymore, that shame of being captured is too great, so he asks for mercy. It's genuinely interesting to watch play out, and leads to one of the best moments of the entire episode, and possibly Chibnall's single greatest addition to Doctor Who canon in this hilarious exchange.
Sontar! Ho! Sontar!
I have no notes. That's probably the funniest thing from this entire era. And if I'm being honest, I'm a bit of a Sontar ho myself. And the character of Skak works pretty well as the leader of the Sontarans. He's the main one who serves as the face of this larger army, and his presence worked really well for me. The stuff with the tongue and the whole new design for the Sontarans feels fitting for this era, and also just weird enough to not be the most serious thing in the world, yet the episode does treat the Sontarans as the threats they are, and it's this fine balance that it pulled off surprisingly well. They weren't incredible as villains, but personally I found them to be really solid, and Skak worked well as their leader. And I also liked how we as an audience came to see what the Sontarans were doing, and how they used the Flux to their advantage in taking over Earth. Obviously they've tried invading it a couple of times before to very limited success, so I appreciated how they were using this massive event to gain an advantage. It was well integrated within the show and felt like a neat way to utilize the Flux, more so than I was expecting the writers to do. Minor complaint here, but that moment after the Doctor, the British General, and Skak are talking, when you see that both of their armies were right there the whole time, that felt really odd to me because it was just like, oh, they were just waiting there the whole time, even though the audience never really got an indication that there were soldiers there. Maybe it was supposed to be a cool reveal, but for me it felt odd. That's such a minor complaint and doesn't really affect my enjoyment of the episode, but I did want to mention it. And the episode makes the interesting and largely wise choice to actually split up our three main characters, which ended up playing out for the show's benefit. For one thing, it's nice because it allows us to follow the Doctor without her regular companions, which is just an interesting dynamic to see. Mary Seacole, who was perfectly fine in the episode, though she only gets so much focus in the context of everything else that's happening, basically serves as a temporary companion for the Doctor's section of the story. And yeah, she works fine enough. But I was mostly more engaged by the fact that the Doctor had to deal with this problem while knowing that her companions are God knows where, and there's an army of Sontarans to deal with. She's not entirely alone, but she does have to really be the driving force without the assistance of her usual team, which I enjoyed watching. I also really liked the shot where you see her walking around the TARDIS and there's no doors anywhere. That was a great little moment to show how things are going wrong and how little she has at her disposal to deal with this threat. That opening was pretty cool as well, rather eerie and intriguing, and it certainly caught my attention right from the start of the episode. Jodie Whittaker worked quite well for me here. I felt that I got a fair bit more from her character than last week, and her more comedic moments landed a lot better as well. I've always enjoyed her incarnation, at times more than others, and it was nice to see her working well within this chapter. In terms of everything going on with Dan, I mostly enjoyed it, but I also felt a little more mixed on his scenes. It's nice that we get a better sense of his home life, and his parents worked relatively well as characters, but I also feel that I ultimately didn't take that much away from their interactions. I have no genuine issue with it, but there just wasn't that much there for me, and it's certainly not the part of the chapter I am going to remember when thinking back on this one. Also, they brought back the Carvanista, which you may recall I wasn't that big of a fan of in the previous episode, and while it worked okay here and made logical sense to be back, I personally just wasn't really here for that character. They took away from the episode more than they added to it, and I would have liked this thing more had they not been in it. Oh, and though a fair amount of the humor landed for me, that bit with the Doctor and Dan saying the same thing to each other just felt so forced that I couldn't help but cringe a little.
Where are you?
Still in the Crimea!
Where's Yaz?
I don't know! You
Speak first.
It's not the end of the world that a joke didn't land for me, and I am glad that this episode had a lot more humor that connected with me than the previous one, but I did want to point out this moment that took me out of the show for a bit. There's also that moment where Dan's running away from the Sontarans and they have just terrible aim, which I've seen a lot of discourse about, and most of it is terrible. Look, it's stupid, and it does undermine the threat of the Sontarans a bit. Like, it genuinely took me out of the episode when they shoot at him dozens of times and just never landed a single shot. Obviously, you're not going to kill your companion here, but it's not exactly thrilling to watch a character run away from potatoes who are terrible shots. I don't know what I'm really supposed to gain from this sequence, and I do believe it does lessen the episode a little bit, but having said that, it doesn't bother me terribly much. Only during the actual sequence because it's the only thing I can think about. But it doesn't do much to harm the rest of the episode, and even though I don't like it, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it damages this chapter in any meaningful way. But the discourse around this is worse than the moment itself. Yes, you're allowed to criticize silly things like this. No, it's not actually that big of a deal. That's my stance and I'm sticking to it. I don't know why some people are afraid of criticisms of the show. Just because one thing didn't work doesn't mean I'm crying for the death of Doctor Who. People seem to get emotionally attached to criticisms because they hold the show as a pinnacle of their identity and view criticisms of it as a criticism of themselves, which is not really the best way to engage with media, though it's not like I've never been guilty of that. And that's enough about that. Let's move on to more important things. The stuff with Yaz and Vinder works decently. I mean, it's fairly engaging to watch and certainly an intriguing situation to present these characters and the audience with, but like with the Dan stuff, I definitely didn't get as much from this part of the story as I did the stuff with the Doctor. I liked it overall, but don't consider it to be all that great. I like the design of these creatures and the makeup that we see on them. I thought it was a pretty cool look which came together quite well, and I'm certainly intrigued about whatever we're going to get with them and this planet in the rest of Flux. And this does lead me to the villains of the piece, Swarm and Azure. Look, I don't hate them, they're not terrible, but they just don't land with me and are the single thing I can point to from what I consider to be a good episode as the weak link. They're pretty campy, they're not that threatening, and the show hasn't done much to actually characterize them yet, so maybe we'll get more from them later which makes them work for me, but here they don't add all that much. and Azur's over-the-top sinister laughing was just a tad much for me.
And I am your death.
Having said that, I do enjoy that over the course of this serial, they are using cliffhangers that very much feel like classic Who cliffhangers. I may not have gotten much from the previous one, but I kind of appreciated just how much this one felt like a classic Who cliffhanger, with the sting kicking in as we see Swarm about to snap. It's not particularly threatening, you know, I don't necessarily feel the danger for our characters, but it's just kind of fun and I enjoyed that.
All in good time.
Overall, I had a really good time with this episode and really enjoyed the main story with the Sontarans and the Doctor. This one does a rather good job of balancing the main storyline with the continuing Flux arc, and even though there were parts of this one that I enjoyed more than others, viewed on the whole it was quite a solid piece, which I found myself rather entertained by. This was definitely a strong chapter, and I'm going to give War of the Sontarans a rating of 7.75 out of 10. And that does it for this review. Be sure to leave your thoughts on this one down below if you feel like doing so. I will be back soon with a review of Once Upon Time, as well as the rest of Flux, a classic Doctor Who Season 13 serial ranking, and even more in the future. So I hope to see you around for some of that, and if not, that is absolutely fine, so long as you know that I appreciate your time here today. And with that said, thank you very much for watching, take care, and have a lovely week.